Imagine for a moment. What if everything you thought you knew about your own mind, your sense of self, even where your intelligence actually comes from, what if that was just, the tip of the iceberg? What if the lines we draw around ourselves, around our thoughts, are kind of, well, just plain wrong? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some fascinating territory. We've got this amazing interview with Michael Levin. He's a developmental biologist, and Anna Ciaunica, a cognitive scientist. Plus, we're looking at a critique of their ideas and this really foundational paper by Clark and Chalmers on the extended mind. Our mission today, it's to really unpack these pretty radical ideas that challenge how we think about consciousness, memory, what it even means to be a self. So yeah, get ready for maybe a few aha moments. We're exploring how consciousness might not just be locked inside our heads.
Right, might extend way beyond the brain. We're talking about intelligence potentially down at the cellular level or even involving our environment.
Exactly. These experts, Levin and Ciaunica, they're really pushing the boundaries, rethinking everything from how cells might think to what being an individual even means when we're so interconnected.
Okay, so let's start by pulling back the curtain on some of these really big, long-held beliefs. Levin and Ciaunica jump right in, tackling what they call the largest myths in their fields. The stuff everyone just assumes is true. For Levin, in developmental biology, the big one is this idea that intelligence has to be tied to brains and neurons. That's the only place it can happen. And he says, point blank, that's deeply wrong.
Yeah, it's a huge claim. And what's really fascinating is when you look at the actual mechanics, the building blocks of what brains do. Things like ion channels, right?
Yeah.
Electrical synapses, those little gap junctions between cells, even neurotransmitters. These things are ancient. Evolutionarily speaking, they were around long before multicellular life even got going. You find versions of them in bacterial biofilms, these sort of slimy microbial communities.
Bacterial biofilm,
Yeah.
seriously. Seriously. Which means the basic abilities, learning from experience, solving problems in different kinds of spaces, like physiological or metabolic spaces, even managing gene expression. These things existed way before brains or muscles or even moving around in 3D space came along. So these capacities, they're actually widespread across life. They're not unique to us brainy creatures at all. It suggests intelligence, or at least computation, is much more fundamental.
Okay, wow. And then Anna Ciaunica, she goes after a similar myth in philosophy, but about the self. And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting, maybe even a bit uncomfortable. She challenges this whole adult-centric view, the idea that we start our analysis assuming the self is already fully formed, this complete static thing.
Exactly. She says we've got it backwards. We shouldn't start with the self. We should start with the other. Her line is really provocative. You cannot be yourself by yourself because the other was there from the very beginning.
Whoa.
Yeah. And she uses this great metaphor, the epicycle thing. And remember how ancient astronomers just knew planets had to move in perfect circles?
Right, and they kept adding circles within circles to make the data fit instead of ditching the idea of perfect circles.
Precisely. Ciaunica says we're doing the same thing with the self. We cling to this idea of a fixed, individual, already formed adult self, and we keep adding complexity to explain away all the evidence that it's actually dynamic, relational, and develops over time. We need to just drop that fixed idea, she argues, if we ever want to truly understand how a self actually emerges from, well, initially just a bunch of cells. It's called to fundamentally reframe how we even ask the question.
That really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? Like, what are our own ingrained assumptions about where intelligence sits or how we define me? Could those be our own epicycles, just blocking our view of something deeper?
It's a powerful question. Are we holding on to frameworks that just don't fit the data anymore?
So Ciaunica talks about her own kind of aha moment, this sort of chain reaction of realizations that changed everything for her. She started out trying to do what a lot of people do, map brain states directly onto subjective feelings. The classic mind-body problem. How does squishy brain stuff connect to immaterial thoughts and feelings?
Right. And she realized the whole field was sort of stuck in what she calls outdated physical science, obsessed with this layer cake model. Physics at the bottom, then chemistry, biology, psychology, and consciousness is just the little cherry on top.
Yeah, I can picture that.
And the big challenge was always seen as, how do you connect that cherry way up there with the physics way down at the bottom? But her breakthrough was realizing that the key wasn't the individual bricks in each layer, or even just stacking them up. It was the interconnectedness, the relationships between the layers, how physics gives rise to chemistry, how chemistry enables biology. She argues that if you keep the relationships the same, you could potentially change the bricks, the specific components, and still end up with similar systems. The connections are key.
Okay, that's interesting. How does she illustrate that?
She uses this metaphor of mapping a table. You could just draw a straight line across that's fast, gets you a basic map.
Sure.
Or you could take tours. Go right, then left, then right, then left, zigzagging all over the surface. It's slower, obviously,
Right.
but it maps the surface much better. You get a richer understanding by exploring it from all these other perspectives. It's about depth of understanding, not just speed.
I like that. It connects to this other big point. They both make the problem with disciplinary silos. How science and philosophy often operate in their own little worlds, leading to these unshakable assumptions that seem totally normal inside the silo, but bizarre from the outside.
Levin gives a really great example. He says if he tells neuroscientists that, hey, information processing in cells involves electrophysiological circuits and memory, not just genetics, they're like, yeah, duh,
Yeah.
old news. But then if he says, and it doesn't have to be neurons doing it, or asks what even is a neuron fundamentally, suddenly that's weird. They get uncomfortable. Now, take the same basic idea to a molecular genetics department. Tell them it's all driven by electrophysiology and experience, not just genes. They'll say the first part is obvious. Of course it's the genes. But the idea that experience, like in those two-headed planarian experiments where memory seems to transfer even after decapitation and regeneration, the idea that experience could change cell behavior without changing the genes, that's completely bizarre to them.
Wow. So the same facts are obvious or bizarre depending on which department you're in.
Exactly. It shows how deeply our training shapes what we can even conceive of.
It makes you wonder, have you ever run into that? You know, talking to friends in different jobs or even different social groups, and something you take for granted is just totally alien to them.
All the time. It's that clash of assumptions.
So the upshot is,
Yeah.
we need to break down these walls.
That seems to be the argument. That real understanding, especially of something as complex as consciousness or selfhood, requires dropping the rigid boundaries and actually talking to each other, using tools from different fields. More integration.
Okay, so if we're challenging the old ideas, we need a new way to define the self, right? Especially if it's not just confined to the brain. Levin actually offers a definition that tries to cover everything. Cells, AI, aliens, swarms, robots.
Yeah, he proposes thinking of the self not as a thing, but as an ongoing, basically a kind of self-referential process. It's a process that tries to tell a coherent story about something continuous, something with particular boundaries, and crucially, particular goals. And it's always projecting forward into the future. A key feature for him is some degree of goal-directedness. And he uses this idea of a cognitive light cone.
A cognitive light cone, like from physics.
Sort of. The
Yeah.
idea is that the scale of the biggest goals the system can pursue tells you something about its level of cognition. How far ahead can it plan? How broad are its concerns?
Okay, give me an example.
Well, if all you care about is the sugar concentration right here, right now, you're basically a bacterium. Tiny light cone.
Right, makes sense.
If you're maintaining a state, maybe over a few hundred yards, thinking maybe a little bit ahead, like a dog might, you know, not really worried about what's happening 10 miles away or 4 months from now, that's a medium-sized light cone.
Okay.
But if you're working towards, say, world peace or trying to figure out financial markets 100 years out, now you're talking human-level cognition, a very large light cone. And he even muses about something beyond that, some kind of body software capable of compassion for all beings, an even wider cone.
So the self isn't fixed, it's this dynamic process defined by the scale of its goals and its story about itself.
Exactly. It's plastic, it's goal-oriented, it's constantly defining its boundaries.
Building on that, Levin introduces this really practical idea, the spectrum of persuadability. It's kind of an engineer's take on how we should interact with different systems.
Yeah, it's super useful. He gives 4 points on the spectrum: a mechanical clock, a thermostat, a dog, and a human. And the key question is, what are the bag of tools that you're going to bring to optimally relate to that system? What actually works?
Okay, so the clock.
With a clock, you can't persuade it, reward it, punish it, nothing. Your only tool is to physically rewire the hardware if it's broken. It has no goals you can appeal to.
Right. Then the thermostat.
Now that's interesting. It is a goal-seeking system. You don't need to know how it works inside, but you can interact with its goal. You set the temperature, you rewrite its goal, and then you trust its autonomy to achieve it. That's where cybernetics, control theory, those tools come in.
Makes sense. And the dog.
Or a horse. Think about it. Thousands of years before neuroscience, we figured out how to train them. Rewards, punishments, tools from behavioral science. They have this amazing interface, Levin says, that lets us interact effectively without needing to know the deep neuroscience.
And finally, humans.
With humans, the tools become incredibly subtle but powerful. A convincing argument, a story, even just a whisper, as he puts it, can completely change someone's life trajectory. Now you're using tools from psychoanalysis, communication theory, maybe even rhetoric.
It's about choosing the right level of interaction for the system's capabilities.
Precisely. It's an empirical claim about what works.
But what about goals for things we don't think of as conscious? Like, does a cell have a goal in this framework?
Ciaunica jumps in here. She connects it back to maybe the most fundamental goal of all living systems, simply to stay alive. It's this intrinsic embodied drive. It's there even when you're asleep or in a coma. It's shared with viruses, cats, dogs. Just keep going, keep going.
Well,
All our fancier explicit goals, like wanting to be an artist or whatever, are built on top of that fundamental biological imperative.
that makes sense. Although we did see some pushback online, right? People suggesting maybe even rocks feeling gravity or computers processing data are on some kind of spectrum, too.
Yeah, you see those arguments. But the counter is usually that rocks don't sense in a biological way, and computers run on switches we designed and programmed. They don't have inherent drives or senses in the same way a living cell does.
Right. It's a different category of goal, if you can even call it that.
Hmm.
This framework helps clarify those distinctions, I think. It forces you to think about the right tools for the job.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Levin mentioned some really new research from his lab, like preprint stuff, proposing a totally different way to think about aging. We usually think of it as either damage accumulating, like a machine wearing out, or maybe some kind of programmed obsolescence, right?
Yeah, those are the two main theories. But this new idea, it's wild. It suggests aging might not be about the hardware breaking down or a program running out. Instead, it could be a fundamental feature of these goal-directed cognitive systems we've been talking about.
How so?
The theory is basically that once a system achieves its main goal, like for an organism, growing up, staying stable, reproducing, if there's then no new goal and no reinforcement of the old goal, things start to degrade. It's not necessarily physical damage, but the system kind of does not know what to do anymore. Without a driving purpose or goal, the complex order it maintains starts to break down into disorder. It's like a cognitive system losing its coherence.
Wow. A crisis of goals leads to aging.
That's the provocative idea.
Yeah.
Levin uses this crazy analogy, his words, of a Judeo-Christian heaven. Imagine infinite bliss forever.
Right.
He says a snake might be fine just doing snake things forever.
Yeah.
Or a dog on a perfect farm with rabbits. But a human, he says, I'm not at all certain that we could keep ourselves sane over 1 billion years, 1 trillion years. We seem to need new challenges, new goals to stay coherent.
So eternal bliss might actually lead to disintegration for complex minds.
It's a mind-bending thought, isn't it? That purpose is essential not just for meaning, but for maintaining structural integrity.
Ciaunica totally agrees with this need for open-endedness, right?
Absolutely. She embraces it. She even argues that eternal life is a bit like an oxymoron. She asks her students, what's the opposite of death? People say life. But she says, no, the opposite of death is birth. Life, she says, is what stays between birth and death. And to even be aware of life, to really experience it, you need some darkness somewhere in the corner. It's the contrast, the tension between beginning and end that gives the experience its richness and meaning.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And it leads her to another interesting point. If death is one boundary, what about birth? She notes how philosophy is obsessed with death, but seems to have largely ignored birth.
Yeah, she wonders if that's partly due to a long history of male thinking in philosophy, maybe overlooking the embodied experience of pregnancy and birth. She calls birth the invisible face of the moon, universal, fundamental, yet strangely absent from much of our deep thinking about existence.
It's a significant blind spot. So putting this all together, the self isn't static, it needs goals, it's bounded by birth and death. What does this mean for memory? If the self is constantly changing, how do memories work?
Well, it means the self isn't just a box holding old recordings. It's an active constructor. Levin explains we don't actually access the past. We access engrams, these compressed, optimized traces left by previous you. And every moment, you have to reinterpret those memory structures.
and continuously tell and retell a coherent story about what you are, how you got here, what the outside world means, what you do next. It's a constant building process.
So memory recall isn't like playing a video, it's more like rebuilding a narrative from fragments.
Exactly. It's always filtered through your present self. He uses the caterpillar to butterfly example again here.
Yeah.
The caterpillar brain gets torn down, rebuilt as a butterfly brain. The specific memories about leaves are useless. But the deep lessons, maybe about danger or navigation, they persist. But they have to be remapped and reinterpreted to be useful in the butterfly's totally different world. The memory agent has to change to survive.
Which leads to that paradox you mentioned. If you don't change, you will die. If you do change, you are no longer yourself. It really forces you to question what continuity of self even means.
It really does. And then he adds another layer.
Oh boy.
He suggests the patterns themselves and perhaps the memories themselves have agency of their own. He echoes William James' thoughts aren't just passive data, they're like thinkers. Persistent thoughts can actually modify the brain, like building your own internal niche.
Our thoughts shape our brains, not just the other way around.
That's the idea, which Ciaunica completely agrees with. She pushes back hard against thinking of amnesia as just flicking a switch off. She says even if you can't explicitly recall something, there's still a powerful encoding in the body. Think of nonverbal children who've experienced trauma. They might not remember it consciously, but their bodies hold the memory in how they move, how they react. The body never forgets.
So memory is much deeper, more embodied than just conscious recall.
Definitely. Like the Proustian Madeleine. A smell or taste triggers this huge rush of feeling and memory, completely bypassing language. Memory is a continuum. Language is just one tool to access parts of it. Our adult focus on language might actually blind us to these deeper forms.
And Ciaunica loops this back beautifully to her idea of the other and the origin of self using pregnancy. She points out, all of us here shared our body with the body of another person, hence the pregnant state is universal state.
Right, so forget the isolated individual as the starting point. The real unit of analysis is the individual within another individual, which is within another society. It highlights interconnectedness from the absolute beginning. And she stresses the incredible wisdom happening at the cellular level during pregnancy way before brains are involved.
What kind of wisdom?
Well, you have two immune systems, the pregnant persons and the fetuses that have to communicate and negotiate. The placenta isn't just a wall, it's like a hybrid immune system, an intermediary relational organ managing this dialogue. She talks about 3 stages. An inflammatory one early on, morning sickness, which is like a tough negotiation phase. Can these two systems actually coexist? Then a bliss stage of agreement, and then another inflammatory stage for birth.
And the high rate of miscarriage in the first trimester.
Is evidence of that tough negotiation. Sometimes the cellular dialogue fails.
So the very first thing we learn at a cellular level is how to negotiate with another organism.
Exactly. That embodied lesson in collaboration and relating to another forms the bedrock for all later social learning. It's a profound reframing of where we begin.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to connect this with that Clark and Chalmers paper on the extended mind. This idea that the mind isn't just inside the skull.
Right, active externalism. The environment isn't just input, it's an active part of cognition. Their argument is pretty direct. If a process counts as cognitive when it happens in the head, why doesn't it count just because it's partly happening out in the world?
And they use that great thought experiment, Inga and Otto.
Yeah, Inga uses her biological memory to remember the museum is on 53rd Street. Simple. Otto has Alzheimer's, relies constantly on his notebook. He writes things down, looks them up, trusts the notebook completely.
It's basically his external memory.
Exactly. Clark and Chalmers say, functionally, Otto's notebook is part of his memory system, part of his belief system. It meets the criteria. Reliably available, automatically endorsed, consciously endorsed in the past. If Inga's internal recall is cognitive, Otto's notebook-aided recall should be too. Where the boundary is drawn seems arbitrary.
So the boundary between mind and world isn't skull-bound.
That's their claim. They even suggest our brains evolved to use the environment, to offload cognitive work. And language itself is maybe the ultimate tool for extending cognition out into the world, letting us think together in ways we couldn't alone.
Makes you think about your phone, right? Or notes. Or even just talking a problem through with someone. Are they just tools or actually part of the thinking process itself?
It's a fascinating question for everyday life.
And these ideas clearly echo what Levin and Ciaunica are saying about intelligence extending beyond the brain, maybe even down to cells. Which brings us to the whole cellular basis of consciousness or CBC debate.
Right, this is where things get really controversial. Proponents, Like Reber and others who align with Levin and Ciaunica make this huge claim. All living organisms, down to prokaryotes, have consciousness.
All the way down to bacteria.
That's the idea. Consciousness and intelligence didn't wait for brains, they argue. They co-evolved with the very first cells. They point to single cells doing things that look cognitive, sensing, communicating, learning, remembering, making decisions. The cell membrane itself is seen as this complex sensing organ. They highlight cell-to-cell chatter, microbial communication, even plant signaling, like those willow trees warning each other.
But this is heavily debated. We found strong counter-arguments, too.
Oh, absolutely. There's a paper, Cell Consciousness, a dissenting opinion, that directly refutes CBC. Critics say it lacks empirical evidence. It's mostly educated speculation.
What are their main points?
One big one is terminology confusion. They argue CBC conflates things like sentience, consciousness, cognition, intelligence. You can have complex information processing cognition without subjective feeling, consciousness. The mainstream neuroscience view, they say, is still that consciousness needs a nervous system of a certain complexity, emerging maybe 500 million years ago.
What about bacteria navigating or remembering chemical trails?
Critics argue that's complex, yes, but it's hardwired biochemistry, predictable reactions based on the cell's current state. Not conscious or volitional decisions in the way we mean it for humans. It's sophisticated programming, essentially.
And plants feeling pain.
They call that demonstrably false. Plant responses are programmed adaptations. Neurotransmitters in plants have different jobs than in brains. Anesthetics released by plants are defense chemicals, not for self-pain relief.
So no little plant minds suffering when we mow the lawn, according to this view.
According to this view, no. And the idea of cells having theory of mind, knowing what other cells know, they dismiss that as lacking evidence even for most mammals, let alone single cells. It's a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes evidence in consciousness itself.
This whole debate really throws us into deep philosophical waters, doesn't it? Like panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is fundamental to matter itself.
Exactly. And Sam Coleman's paper on Thomas Nagel's argument for panpsychism is key here. Nagel builds this case, arguing consciousness has to be a property of the basic stuff of the universe.
What's his argument based on?
4 premises. P1, we're made of physical stuff. Material composition, no souls. P2, consciousness can't be fully reduced to physics. Non-reductionism, the explanatory gap, shown by thought experiments like Mary the Color Scientist. P3, consciousness is real, realism. And P4, consciousness must be fundamental like mass, not emergent like liquidity, because if it emerged, you just push the mystery of how it arises down a level.
So it has to go all the way down to the basic particles.
That's Nagel's argument. Because any basic matter could potentially be part of a conscious being, it must all have some proto-conscious property. Coleman explores how Nagel wrestled with whether this is pure panpsychism or maybe neutral monism, where the basic stuff is neither mental nor physical, but something more fundamental that gives rise to both.
Okay, my head is spinning slightly.
It's deep stuff.
Okay.
But it tackles the core mystery. How does non-feeling stuff give rise to feeling? Is consciousness baked into the universe? Or does it pop into existence only with complex structures like brains?
Wow. What a journey we've taken. From single cells potentially having intelligence to minds extending into notebooks to consciousness perhaps being woven into the fabric of reality itself. We've really seen how questioning those basic assumptions about neurons being special, about the self being isolated, about where the mind stops, just opens up entirely new ways of seeing things. So after all that, what really sticks with you? What's the big takeaway?
For me, it's really this idea that the old disciplinary silos just aren't working anymore. If we want to understand these big questions, self, consciousness, life, we have to make connections.
Yeah.
Connections between biology, physics, computer science, philosophy, psychology, even things like architecture or history. As Levin says, you need people from psychiatry, trauma studies, machine learning. All the tools are needed to grasp the deeper patterns of nature. Collaboration across fields is key.
That makes a lot of sense. And Ciaunica's point about our tools shaping the reality we see, that feels really important too.
Yeah, her warning. We need to be aware of the tools that we are using because the tools we're using changes basically the reality we're looking at. Our adult, often language-heavy toolkit carves up a continuous reality into discrete boxes, but maybe reality isn't always box-shaped.
Right. The map isn't the territory.
Exactly. And she urges us to stop thinking in simple, linear progressions from dumb to smart. Nature gives us the right tool at the right moment. We need to appreciate the humble roots, the intelligence of the cells, intelligence of the body. The mind isn't just driving a dumb machine. It's a deep collaboration between all levels. Intelligence is everywhere, just in different forms.
So the final thought for you, our listener, maybe is this. This whole deep dive fundamentally challenges where you begin and end. If your memories are constantly being rewritten, if your thinking process literally extends out into your phone or your environment, if your very beginning was a cellular negotiation, then what part of you is really fixed, really independent? And maybe, just maybe, how might understanding the potential intelligence in a single cell change how you view your own body, your own identity, or even the world buzzing with life all around you? Definitely some food for thought there, something to chew on until our next deep dive.